Alright, what is up, everybody? Final Fantasy is on its way out, somehow. We've gotten to, like, what, 6 weeks, 7 weeks with the format? And we're already on to Edge of Eternities preview season. We are in the midst of things right now. The entire set is not completely out, but we have a good idea of what's going on. So I'm going to hop on, talk about what I think is going on in the set, point out some interesting quirks about it, point out some cards I think are kind of interesting, and yeah, just give you my first impressions before the set review, which will be next Monday, by the way, for those looking for the full set review. Okay, let's jump in. So the big new mechanic, the flashy brand new thing, is these spacecrafts. So if you haven't seen these before, these are artifacts that can turn into creatures eventually. So for example here, we've got Ulthros Scanship. This is a 3 and a blue artifact that comes in, you draw 2 cards, you then discard a card, and it has the station mechanic, which is what eventually turns these artifacts into creatures. So station says, tap another creature you control, put charge counters equal to its power on this spacecraft. Station only has a sorcery, and it's an artifact creature if the number of counters, in this case, are 8 or more. So you've got a 4 mana, draw 2, then discard a card. Not the best effect in the world, but then it eventually becomes a 4/4 flyer. This one in particular is actually a little bit reminiscent of the side quest card collection from Final Fantasy, very much a similar card, a little bit of filtering early and then turns into a flyer later. The range of enter the battlefield effects on these are kind of interesting too, because with the Scanship here, okay, it's a minor effect, you're not putting it in your deck for this effect necessarily, you're like putting it in your deck for the whole package, where something like Rescue Skiff, which is a 6 mana white spacecraft that when it enters, return target creature or enchantment from the graveyard to the battlefield, and eventually turns into a 5/6 flyer. This one's a little more like, okay, my deck wants a reanimation spell, I'm going to play that, and it's nice that this reanimation spell eventually turns into a threat itself. The big question I've seen floating around with these spacecrafts, kind of the concern a lot of people have had, is this mechanic too slow? Because it's a lot of work, right? Like tapping 8 power worth of creatures to just get a 4/4 flyer. Are you actually going to want to do this? And my impression is yes. My impression is yes, this is going to be a good mechanic. This is something you're going to want in your deck. At very least, I can say I have some confidence because this is the main mechanic of the set. And, you know, Wizards has gotten main mechanics of the set wrong before, but they've got a fairly good track record. I trust them that, at least, you know, without playing the set, benefit of the doubt, I have some optimism that this is going to work out. But aside from that, just general optimism, I think they're not too slow as long as you're not thinking of them as, well, I'm going to put this Scanship in my deck, I'm going to cast it on 4, and the rest of my game, it's going to be devoted to turning this thing on. I think of it a little more like a thing to do once the game sort of simmered down, right? Sort of like a board stall breaker. It's not exactly a mana sink, right? Because you're not sinking mana into these, but it's a resource sink, right? So you can kind of think of it as, let's imagine the board stall out, a bunch of little small things running around, a bunch of 2/2s and 3/3s, they're not really going to get in. But if you just got a spacecraft lying around, you're like, okay, well, you know, put them all in the spacecraft and eventually I have something that can break through the board stall. That's a little more how I'm thinking about these. They're also kind of similar in that same way to battles, if you want to make that comparison, where they're an effect up front and then they turn into a thing, a piece of material, some card advantage in a way, if you want to flip them by turning creatures sideways, or very similar actually, right? You're turning creatures sideways, but these stations, you know, you don't have to get into combat for them. So it's actually a very similar mechanic, I think, in a lot of ways to battles. Also, there are a lot of cards that incentivize you to play these spacecrafts. For example, something like Focus Fire is a removal spell that scales if you have spacecrafts. This is actually one of a handful of removal spells that scale if you have spacecrafts. There's also a lot of cards that want you to have an outlet to be able to tap your cards. So for example, the red-white signpost here. 4 mana 2/4, at the beginning of your end step, if you control 2 or more tapped creatures, you make it 2/2 robot token. There's a lot of cards that pay you off for having tapped creatures. There are cards that in themselves want to be tapped. So like there's like a 2 mana 2/2 that when it gets tapped, you scry 1. So yeah, part of this is not just thinking about, okay, well, what do I get at the end of the day when I tap all these creatures and, you know, I've put a bunch of power into these spacecrafts. Part of it is like, well, you can also think of it the other way, where it's like these spacecrafts actually enable a lot of the other cards in the set. You just want them so you can tap your creatures in some spots. They've also mentioned on some preview streams that this limited format, they did try to intentionally make a little bit slower, a little more like battle cruisery magic where you're, you know, going over the top, casting your big thing. My first impression when looking at this set is sort of Rise of the Eldrazi-ish for those who played that set. For those who didn't play that set, Rise of the Eldrazi was all about these big monsters, and, you know, 2 mana 2/2s weren't as relevant. You actually, like, were making a big mistake if you put, like, vanilla 2 mana 2/2 in your deck. Things were really about going over the top. I don't think this set is quite that far in that direction, but it's got some hints of it, right? Like, I imagine a lot of the games in this format are going to be a little more drawn out, a little more about accruing resources, a little more about going over the top, and I imagine some games will turn into, okay, who can get their spacecraft online first, because that's the thing that matters. A card that caught my eye, not trying to say this is like a great common or anything, but just kind of caught my eye, is Pinnacle Killship. This is the 7 mana, comes in, deals 10 damage to one creature. It's a spacecraft. It is a 7/7 flyer, and the station number is 7. So, yeah, I'm just curious to see where this one falls, because I could see it falling to, like, okay, like, 23rd playable that you don't really want to play, but you could play. I could see this being just, like, a rock-solid common if the format is in this direction enough, where you just, like, really want the spacecrafts, really want some top end. It's just a little bit of a strange card to print at common as a colorless card, being a pretty high impact card. It might just be the case where, 7 mana for this effect, not what you want, 7 mana removal spell. But, long term, this is a 7/7 flyer that kills something. I don't know. We'll see. Next up, we've got the Warp mechanic. And Warp is sort of kind of a spin on adventure, I would say. So, for example, we've got Starbreach Whale, which is a 5 mana 3/5 flyer. When it enters, you can surveil 2. But it also has Warp for 2 mana. And if you paid for its Warp cost, this is the whole thing, you put it on the battlefield, but then it exiles at the end step. So you don't get to block with it, you don't get to attack with it, unless it has haste. And you can cast it from exile later, at a later date. So that's the adventure side, right? Like, for the Whale, you're stuck on 2 mana, you go, okay, I'll cast the Warp side instead of playing a 2-drop, I want to be able to hit my lands, great, you do that. You smooth out your draws, fine, you cast this later. Mechanizoa, another example here, is a 6 mana 5/5 that when it comes in, it taps something your opponent controls, put a stun counter on it, the Warp cost is 3, so it's like, okay, I don't have a 3-drop, I'll lock down their 2-drop for a turn, just something to do with my mana. But I think the fact that the creature actually is on the battlefield is going to make this play fairly differently. So just an easy example here is something like Drix Fatemaker. This is a 4 mana 3/2 in green that says, when it enters, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have trample, and the Warp cost is 1 in a green. So this is a little bit different. It's not just like, okay, I'll cast this early because I have nothing else to do. I mean, you might do that, but really I'm seeing this more on like a combo or a lethal turn, where you go like, okay, I have a pump spell, and I've got this pretty big creature, and, in a normal, if this was a normal creature, you might not be able to cast the pump spell and have this effect of your creatures have trample. But you're like, okay, I got 4 mana, I can warp it in, put a counter on, cast my pump spell. That's how I find lethal. There's also some of these warp cards that are fairly modal in what they do, where their warp cost and their actual, when I finally cast this, is quite a bit different. So All Fate Stalker, as a good example here, this is a 4 mana 2/3. Then when it enters, you exile up to 1 target non-assassin creature until this creature leaves. So it's kind of your classic, comes in, exiles something until I leave. By the way, non-assassin, I don't actually think there's other assassins in this set. I'm pretty sure the reason it specifies this is because you don't want it to, you don't want to accidentally target your own stalker. That would be bad. But this one's got some really interesting play to it, right? Because if you just warp it for 1 and white, you can kill a token, or you can blink one of your creatures. I imagine this card is going to be quite good. Like, just imagine warping it early, killing a token, and then casting this to nab one of their better cards later. So yeah, I definitely have my eyes on this one. It reads like a good card to me, but even maybe a little bit better than these cards tend to be. Also, you have the effect of, well, if I have a very large creature and I warp it in, it can station my spacecraft, right? So that's something kind of cool. There's something like Bygone Colossus, which I think is expressly made for this purpose. This is a 9 mana 9/9 that has warp for 3 mana. So most of the time, you can just warp this in, and you're able to go, okay, well, my spacecraft is fully turned on now because 9 is going to power most of them up. There's some like 10, 11, 12 costs as you get to higher rarities. But yeah, this is kind of like a nice little 1-2 punch, I think, in your spacecraft deck. Also have the Void mechanic, which is sort of supporting the Warp mechanic. So Void says at the beginning of your end step, if a non-land permanent left the battlefield this turn, or a spell was warped, you do a thing, right? It checks to see if something left or you warp. Notably, this is not just your stuff. If you played with the Revolt mechanic, you might kind of short this to like, oh, it's just like slightly different Revolt that cares about warp as well. But it cares about your opponent's stuff too. So it's almost like a mix of Revolt and Crimes from Thunder Junction, right? So, all these Void cards, you can also kind of look at, when I kill my opponent's creature, I get to trigger it. So a bit of a different angle on that kind of effect. The last big mechanic is these Lander tokens. So these are artifact tokens that tap and sack, pay 2 mana, you search your land for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. So these are kind of interesting. Notably, I'll say up front, this is some of the only fixing in this set. This set is actually fairly fixing light, We don't have dual lands at common. I don't even think we have like an Evolving Wild variant or anything. I think they were very careful because they have this lander mechanic where if you have too much fixing, right? Like all your lander cards fix you, and also you have lands that fix you. It can get a little bit soupy, and I think they wanted to try to avoid that. So these lander tokens, number one, are going to be one of your prime sources of fixing, but also just very powerful. So for example, one of the better commons, I imagine going to be one of the best commons in the set, is Galactic Wayfarer. 3 mana 3/3, comes in, makes a lander token. That's just awesome. But aside from fixing your mana and helping you splash, these lander tokens do a few other things. So I think the two main things are, one, they help you enable landfall a bit more. And there's a lot of landfall cards sprinkled throughout the set. It's a fairly heavy theme, actually. So for example, we've got Sunstar Expansionist, which is a 2 mana 2/3, that when it enters, if an opponent controls more lands than you do, you make a lander token, and this thing gets +1/+1 when you landfall. But the other place you're going to care about these lander tokens, aside from just, their effect, is there is a fairly heavy artifact theme in the set. Cards that care about artifacts, cards that say when an artifact enters, do this. When you have 3 artifacts, do this, right? So it's a little bit of an artifact set, especially with those spacecrafts, which are artifacts themselves. We've got Weftstalker Ardent as an example here, 3 mana 2/3, that when another creature or artifact you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. So yeah, overall seems like a pretty powerful mechanic to me. It reminds me a little bit of Environmental Sciences and how that card interacted with the Learn Lesson mechanic from Strixhaven. So for those who didn't play that set, basically there was a mechanic called Learn Lesson where you had some cards were learn cards, some cards were lesson cards. The lesson cards are the ones that you got out of your sideboard when you cast the learn card, and there was one called Environmental Sciences, which search your library for a basic land and you gain 2 life. And when you had that card in your sideboard as from your lesson board, it basically meant that every single card in your deck that learned fixed your mana too, right? So all your cards that learned could be considered splash sources if you were splashing. Kind of the same thing here, where every single card that makes a lander, you can count that as a source as a splash, right? So it just makes splashing a little bit more doable in a set without dual lands. Common dual lands, that is. There are the shock lands at rare, half of them anyways. Past these, though, and I think that's like most of the main mechanics to talk about today, but one thing that stood out to me is just the art in this set is really, really cool. There's a lot of like fuller borders in this set where they, have the art extending past the regular Magic border. There's also a bonus sheet in this set that's a little bit weird. It's sort of similar to the Final Fantasy bonus sheet where it's not actually in every pack. I don't have the exact numbers offhand. Maybe the comments can help me with that. But it's something like 1 every 3 packs or something like that. And then the bonus sheet is cool lands from Magic's past. For example, we've got a Lotus Field here. Really, really awesome art on this one. Another one I thought I'd just like bring up as an example of. This set has some pretty cool land art. But past that, a few cards that caught my eye that I thought were just kind of cool. So the Biomechan Engineer, or Biome-chan, as I first read it, but wherever you want to read it, up to you. But I'll probably be reading this as Biome-chan for the rest of the format. So Biome-chan Engineer is 2 mana 2/2. When it enters, you make a lander token, and 8 mana ability, you make a 2/2 colorless robot token, and you draw 2 cards. So this card seems awesome. Very, very strong, and I do imagine that 8 mana ability is going to be like what a lot of games revolve around. You just got to kill this engineer. And, after you've killed it, well, they still leave behind a lander token. Seems like a phenomenal uncommon, just very, very strong. I imagine one of the best in the set. We've got a really cool simple card, Honor, which is a single white mana for a sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and then draw a card. So simple, so straightforward. There is a +1/+1 theme in green-white. That's kind of green-white's thing this time around. But it's always cool. Like 30 years into Magic, get a one-word name, a one-cost card, very simple text box, and just kind of interesting. It's cool that they're still able to pump out these designs in a world of cards with many, many words, like this next card, which I just want to call out because it's like super weird. And there's actually a lot of cards in the set that make me go, huh, that's kind of weird. Survey Mechan is a 4 mana 1/3 flying creature with hexproof, artifact creature for what it's worth. So weird on its own, 4 mana 1/3 flying hexproof, but it also has this ability, 10 mana, sack this creature. It deals 3 damage to any target. Target player draws 3 cards and gains 3 life. This ability costs X less, where X is the number of differently named lands you control. So sort of like a multicolor build around. Cool card, weird card. And the last thing I want to touch on is this set might break the record for number of board wipes in this set. Like, full set is not completely out yet, but there's like 4 or 5, 6 already. And some of these are, kill just the small things kind of board wipes. They're like, temporary lockdown-esque kind of cards. But there's also a lot that are just like, wipe the whole field and then maybe even get an advantage. So for example, there's this Extinguisher battleship, 8 mana spacecraft, that when it enters, you destroy target non-creature permanent, and then this deals 4 damage to each creature, and it becomes a 10/10 flying trample creature for 5 stationing. So that card seems pretty strong, especially if we think that 8 mana is a doable thing. But I got a few more rats on board here, so just watch out for your pre-release. If you don't watch any more of my content before pre-release, that would be my thing to think about during pre-release. Do worry about a board wipe, because there's a lot of them in this set. Anyways, we're going to pack it up from there. Thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for hanging out for my first impressions. Like I said, next week, Monday, we're going to have the set review, commons and uncommons. Going to stream that to Twitch. Going to post it to YouTube after. Later in the week, we're going to be doing rares and mythics. And if you're not already subscribed, drop a follow, drop a like, drop a subscribe, all that kind of stuff. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.